Welcome to Blue Nile. We hope you are enjoying solving past questions with us. Let's take a look at a big question. We are going to look at a question from the December 2012 exam called Lilly. This question is for 30 marks and covers the following syllabus areas: control deficiencies and recommendations, inventory control system, specifically the inventory count, audit procedures and gathering evidence, and computer-assisted audit techniques. Please note you have 1.8 minutes for every mark in the exam, and for a 30-mark question, no more than 54 minutes should be spent. To successfully complete this question, you will need to plan your answer, taking care with the time allocated to each part of the question, use the scenario where needed, and have clear and efficient communication. It may be worth pausing the video at this point and printing off the exam question. That way you can follow the scenario as we talk through it. As with any question containing a scenario, it is important to plan the answer and the use of the information that has been provided. Reading the requirements before the scenario is important so you can identify what is needed in the scenario faster. This is crucial given the time you have in the exam. Let's now break down to the requirements. Part A asks for the inventory count arrangements of Lilly glass, to identify and explain 6 deficiencies, and provide a recommendation to address each deficiency. This is for 12 marks, and states that the marks will be split equally between each part. Therefore, 6 marks for each part and no more than 22 minutes should be spent on the whole part of this question. This is a standard controls deficiency question, and you will need to apply the information in the scenario to your answer in order to gain the marks. All of the deficiencies will be within the information given. You have to find them, explain why they are deficiencies, and then recommend how to improve the control. Part B asks to describe the procedures to be undertaken by the auditor during the inventory count of Lilly windows, in order to gain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. You will also need to apply the situation in the scenario to the question. While there are plenty of general audit procedures for gathering evidence, during an inventory count, there will be elements of the count in the scenario the auditor would need to clarify. Make sure your audit procedures make sense to Lilly windows. This question is for 6 marks, and is looking for 6 audit procedures that would be carried out by the auditor during the count. No more than 10 minutes should be spent on this part. Part C states for the audit of the inventory cycle and year-end inventory balance of Lilly, to describe 4 audit procedures that should be carried out using computer-assisted audit techniques. To explain the potential advantages of using CATs, and to explain the potential disadvantages of using CATs. This is a 12-mark question, and it states that the marks will be split equally between each part. Therefore, 4 marks for each piece, and no more than 22 minutes spent on the total of Part C. This part of the question still relates to the client within the scenario. However, it requires little application and more knowledge of the capabilities of computer-assisted audit techniques. To pass this part, sound knowledge of CATs is required. Now, let's begin structuring the answers. Part A. We have 2 sub-requirements. One is to identify and explain 6 deficiencies. The other is to provide a recommendation to address the deficiency. Half a mark is allocated for copying the deficiency found within the scenario. Another half a mark is then allocated if you can then explain why it is a deficiency to Lilly Windows inventory system. You would get awarded 1 whole mark for a suitable, well-explained recommendation to deal with the deficiency in the system. These sub-requirements relate to one another, and therefore it is perfectly acceptable to answer Part A in a column format, so you answer Part 1 and 2 side by side. Remember to head up the columns with the title and reference to the question number to make it clear for the marker. The deficiencies can be found within the scenario. As you read through the scenario, make notes, underline or highlight parts of the text that relate to deficiencies. This way you are already planning and structuring your answer, which will help with time management. The key is to find as many deficiencies as possible, and then select the 6 you feel you can answer the best. There are usually more than what is needed within the scenario, so be careful to stick to the requirement, marking allocation, and keep an eye on the time. If at this point you are struggling to identify many deficiencies, it may indicate a lack of preparation in this area. It may be worth going back to your study notes and reviewing internal control systems and deficiencies again before continuing with this video. The 6 that I have selected for this video are: the warehouse manager is supervising the count. The count team do not flag areas once counted. Inventory not on sheets is recorded onto separate blank sheets. Damaged goods are recorded on sheets but not marked. There are continuous movements of inventory during the count. And the warehouse manager is going to measure the raw material quantities. As these have been identified from the scenario, the next step is to explain why they are a deficiency and recommend a suitable alternative control. The warehouse manager is supervising the count. While he is familiar with the inventory, he is also well placed to cover up any potential fraud being carried out by himself or other warehouse team members. His lack of independence could result in inaccurate inventory figures and misstatements within the financial statements. The recommendation would be to ensure that there is a more independent supervisor for the inventory count. This could be the internal audit manager, for example, who is well placed to take on this responsibility. We can see from this approach that on one side we have identified and explained the deficiency in the control. The other side of the page is then to explain the recommendation. The same approach will be taken for the remaining 5 deficiencies. They have an organized, systematic approach to counting, and so do not feel it necessary to mark or flag areas once counted. Even if the approach to counting is organized, humans make mistakes. There is still a risk that areas may be missed when counted, or counted twice in error. Without marking areas, this would not be identified and corrected. The recommendation would be to flag areas once counted so it is clear which areas are still to complete. They have been given sequentially numbered sheets to count from, which is great. However, for items not on those sheets, they are recorded on blank sheets that are not numbered. The problem with this is that there is no way of being sure inventory recorded and collected in at the end of the count is complete. Sheets may go missing, and there is no way of knowing the information is complete. It should therefore be recommended that all sheets, including those for inventory not yet recorded, are sequentially numbered, and the sequence checked when all the sheets are returned to the supervisor. Damaged goods identified is too heavy to move, and so they just make a note of the damage on the count sheets. If left unmarked, these inventory items may be sold with damage, affecting customer goodwill. The write-down of the valuation may also be missed or incorrect, causing misstatements in the inventory balance. The recommendation is all damaged goods identified should be flagged and either moved so no further sales can be made. An assessment of the damage should then be made by the finance team and should then be made so that any write-downs are accounted for. As there is continuous production at Lilly, there will be movements in inventory during the count. It will be difficult for the count team to manage this, and there is a risk that inventory may be missed or items counted when they have been dispatched, causing misstatements in the inventory balance. The recommendation could be to stop production, but this seems unlikely given how they operate. However, organization of what would be needed for the count day could help. For example, estimating the materials needed for the day and keeping those separate. Also, any items completed that day can be stored together and included in the figures at the end of the day. By separating these items, it would reduce the risk of mistakes being made. Finally, to measure raw material quantities, the plan is to get the warehouse manager to perform this, despite there being an expert used historically. It is unlikely they are experienced enough to perform this task, and it increases the risk in misstatements being present due to miscalculations. It should therefore be recommended that they appoint a specialist to come in and complete this task, consistent with previous years. In summary, our 6 deficiencies are: the warehouse manager supervising the count, and they should use an independent supervisor; not flagging areas once counted, and so marking areas is needed; spare sheets not numbered, so sequential number all sheets; damaged items are marked on sheets, but should be flagged in the warehouse also; continuous movements of inventory during the count, so they should organize the movements to reduce the mistakes; and warehouse manager measuring raw materials, and so this should be undertaken by an expert. For Part B, you are required to describe audit procedures to be undertaken by the auditor during the inventory count of Lilly to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. This requirement is very specific to what an auditor can do during the count. Therefore, if it is not practical to complete on the day of the count, you will not get the marks. Any procedure also needs to be able to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence. Remember, for it to be sufficient, it needs to be enough evidence for the auditor to be confident to form an opinion. For it to be appropriate evidence, it needs to be relevant and reliable. This means it must achieve the objectives of the auditor, and the evidence must be from a reliable source so it can be trusted. This also gives confidence when forming an opinion on the financial statements. Remember also, for each audit procedure, it requires a suitable method to obtain the evidence, such as analytical procedures, inquiry, inspection, observation, recalculation, confirmation, and reperformance. Also note, it is asked for audit procedures, not control audit procedures or substantive audit procedures. Therefore, with a general requirement like this, you will gain marks for both control and substantive tests that can be performed on the day. For this 6-mark question, we will need to think of and describe 6 audit procedures that the auditor would carry out during the count. One of the biggest reasons the auditors would be there would be to ensure the controls over the inventory count are effective. Therefore, observing the inventory count teams to identify if they are following instructions would be an important procedure. This would ensure that the inventory count controls are reviewed for deficiencies. As Lilly has continuous movements of inventory, the auditors should also ensure they observe the process of managing these movements to identify if misstatements are likely due to miscounting items. The auditors could also discuss with the client, and in particular the warehouse manager, the methods used to measure the raw materials. As they are not using an expert, the auditor should see if the methods described look reasonable. This may identify potential misstatements in valuing raw materials and would help confirm accuracy of inventory. For damaged items recorded during the count, the auditors should select a sample of items marked on the count sheets and inspect the inventory items. They should see if the damage has been recorded correctly. This would confirm accuracy of the inventory valuation. During every inventory count, the auditors should test count a sample of areas already counted by the count team. They should test in both directions, so select a sample and test from the warehouse to the count sheets, and then from the count sheets to the warehouse. This confirmed completeness and accuracy of inventory. As a final audit procedure, an important one, the auditor must always take a copy of the count sheets with them when they leave the count. This ensures any amendments made after the count can be identified by the auditor and helps verify accuracy. It will also help the auditor later in the audit process perform cutoff procedures to ensure transactions are in the correct accounting period. In summary, 6 audit procedures are: observe the count teams, observe movements in inventory during the count, discuss measurement of raw materials, inspect a sample of damaged items from sheets, recount a sample of inventory items, and take a copy of count sheets at the end of the count. General audit procedures from your studies would have given you a few of the marks, but applying the scenario was needed to gain enough ideas for Part B. Part C has 3 sub-requirements. Part 1 asks to describe 4 audit procedures that could be carried out on the inventory cycle and balance using computer-assisted audit techniques for Lilly. Part 2 and 3 are not directly connected to Part 1, as they ask for general advantages and disadvantages of using CATs. For Part 1, we need to have an awareness of how auditors can use CATs as part of their audit work. There are 2 methods of CATs that can be used by the auditor. One is using test data, which is assessing the computer controls within the client's computerized systems. This is typically done by entering dummy data onto the client systems to see if the controls react appropriately. The second is using audit software to perform substantive tests on the client's transactions and balances. The auditors can import the client's transactions and balances onto their software, which is then programmed to perform substantive audit procedures. As we are reviewing Lilly's inventory cycle and balance, it is more likely audit software would assist than test data for this balance. There are 4 key procedures that audit software generally perform. In practice, there are lots of variations of audit software, as many audit firms have produced their own versions to work with their own clients. We therefore need just a general understanding of what is expected of the software. 1. Task is to calculate ratios. The software can be programmed to automatically calculate ratios, so the auditor can then compare results to the previous year, budgets, and industry averages. Here, the auditors of Lilly could get the software to calculate the inventory days ratio to compare to the previous year and investigate any significant differences with the client. Another task is to recalculate all add-up balances. The software can do this at a press of a button, which then speeds up the task of adding up, which would take an individual within the audit team a long time. The auditors could get the software to add up the inventory list to agree the total for accuracy. Audit software can select samples from the balances that have been imported to then trace to source documents, for example. Here, the auditors could select samples of costs from the inventory valuations that can be traced to the original invoice. It could also select the net realizable values, which can then also be compared to selling prices and costs to identify if valuation of inventory looks reasonable. Finally, another task is to identify or flag up unusual balances or transactions. For the inventory balance, a concern would be if valuation is not overstated. The software could produce an aged inventory list to highlight old or slow-moving items. This could be used to investigate if inventory valuation may need adjustment. And so, CATs are computer techniques used to help the auditor perform the audit work. They have 2 methods. Test data, which inputs dummy data onto the client systems to test controls, and audit software, which imports transactions from the client system to perform substantive testing. This software calculates ratios, adds up and recalculates, selects samples, and highlights unusual items for investigation. Now on to parts 2 and 3, where we need to highlight the pros and cons of using these techniques. Part 2 wants you to explain the advantages of CATs. As the marks are split equally, we have 4 marks, and therefore 4 advantages to explain. If CATs are used over a long period of time, for example, audit software written to use on the client system over a number of years, then it can be cost-effective. Test data is a cheap way to test controls. As CATs are using computers, it reduces human error on the audit, which then reduces detection risk. Auditors can test larger volumes, as it is faster than using more traditional methods. And it frees up the auditor from more mundane tasks, such as adding up, to concentrate on more risky areas and balances where their skills are required. Part 2 requires an explanation of disadvantages of CATs. Once again, we have 4 marks, and so 4 disadvantages are required. Audit software in particular is very expensive to produce, and so because setup costs are high, it is often not cost-effective to use, particularly if the client is looking to change their systems. The software may not be compatible with the client system, and therefore the transferring of transactions may not be possible. Clients may be concerned that accessing their live system may cause corruption, and they may not be comfortable with the auditor doing this. There is also an increased risk of problems with confidentiality. As the audit software would hold all transactions and balances, there may be concern from the client that this information could be leaked from the system and used inappropriately. For both 2 and 3, a clear explanation of each advantage and disadvantage is needed. Leave space between each point and label up your answer clearly. Please remember, to be successful in this type of question, we need to plan the approach and ensure we have identified how long is needed for each part of the question. Use headings to introduce your answers and space out your points so it is clear for the marker where the marks can be allocated. Finally, if there is a scenario, use it. The information was given to you for a reason, and at F8 they are trying to see if you can apply the knowledge to a given scenario, and not just be able to remember the facts. I do hope you found this video useful. Thank you, and good luck.